In most video games, weapons end up being one of the more prominent ways for a player to express themselves. But outside of how they change and affect gameplay, the impact of weapons can also be defined by the method of acquisition, as well as the various enhancements they may bring to the table. This notion would be especially true for the Final Fantasy franchise, which features a vast and iconic collection of weapons. Some of them have become ingrained in the lore, such as the Buster Sword and the Gunblade, but beyond that, there's also a ton of emphasis placed on categorizations, such as the ultimate weapons, used, of course, to boost a character's potential in battle to the maximum. But for every iconic weapon that has a more serious tone, the developers have also been tempted to include weapons that defied convention, designed to do nothing more than provide a bit of humour. Some, such as bird-shaped blades, were still rooted in practical application, but this notion has been extended to toys and even household items, and it means that when looking at the Final Fantasy franchise as a whole, there has been a decent amount of bizarre and amusing weapon selections over the years. For that reason, in today's video, we're going to take a look at some of the weirdest weapons that could be found across the Final Fantasy franchise, and we're going to kick things off with a chicken knife. Making its debut in Final Fantasy V, the chicken knife turned out to be one of the more interesting weapons created within the franchise up until that point. Featuring a simple design, what made the chicken knife quite weird, outside of its name, was that it didn't come with a predetermined damage output. And even though it would deal next to no damage when it was acquired, this meant it actually had the potential to become one of the most powerful weapons in the game. To get the chicken knife, players would have to travel to the town of Moore in the merged world. Here, players would need to navigate through a series of hidden passages in order to find a clearing that featured 2 boxes and an old man. It was at this point that players would need to make a choice. Would they either take the chicken knife, or its counterpart, the Brave Blade, which also had an unconventional formula determining its damage output? When making the decision to choose between the 2 weapons, the game would acknowledge the Brave Blade as intended for those who believed they were, well, brave, and the chicken knife was a choice for cowards, which would push unsuspecting players to choose the more positively advertised Brave Blade. However, its name and description would ultimately belie the chicken knife's true potential. In contrast to the initially powerful Brave Blade, which would decrease in strength each time the player fled from battle, the chicken knife would instead increase in strength each time the party successfully escaped, and as a bonus, it would also factor in the damage multiplier based on the wielding character's agility. With some careful manipulations of these stats via job selection, as well as fleeing from as many encounters as possible, the chicken knife could become one of the most powerful weapons in the game, making it a humorously unexpected yet highly formidable force. The only downside was that each turn there was a 25% chance the character wielding the chicken knife would attempt to flee automatically, which against bosses would represent a wasted turn. Now, due to its status, the chicken knife would end up appearing in many other games. Final Fantasy XI and XIV would both feature their own adaptations, with one being practical and the other being more cosmetic, and it would have a serious application within the Dissidia franchise, where it was redesigned to literally be shaped like a chicken. Taking the creative approach of turning literal tea kettles into melee brawler arms, the Kettle Knuckles from Final Fantasy XIV are up there with some of the series' strangest armaments. Described as a weapon created from the same method as weapons used by the Zodiac Braves, the Kettle Knuckles are relic weapons that distinguish themselves from other bizarre-looking equipment found within Final Fantasy XIV in that they were not necessarily items for glamour, possessing purposeful combat application as well. Obtaining the Kettle Knuckles would also prove to be a demanding task, as players had to complete the level 50 Kettle to the Metal quest located in the North Shroud. On top of that, players would also need to acquire 50 Alexandrite and 10 Tavnarian Mist for trade-in, and they would also need to have completed 3 extreme trials. It was only upon accomplishing these feats that they would be able to purchase the weapons from the merchant Drake. These included the Kettle Knuckles Zenith, and the Kettle Knuckles Nexus. Of these, the Kettle Knuckles Nexus would be the premium version, boasting ample stats to make it a solid choice for monks in combat, and as if to add to their threatening essence, they would not only glow gold, giving off billows of steam, they would also make an eerie whistling noise reminiscent of actual tea kettles. During most of the earlier installments of the Final Fantasy franchise, mages were locked to only a few types of weapons, including daggers, staves, maces, and rods. and this was primarily due to their damage output not relying too much on their physical presence. Final Fantasy X continued this theme, with Yuna using a combination of rods and staves, but the weapon type introduced for Lulu to use was unorthodox to say the least. A far cry from the conventional roster of arms seen in the series so far, Lulu wielded dolls, with each design serving as a throwback to the different mascots seen within the series. The most notable were Moogles and Cactuars, but some were homages to specific mascots such as the Moomba and Poo-Poo, as well as the Onion Knight, Lulu's ultimate weapon, which was an ode to Final Fantasy III. Though it has never been fully explained how exactly the dolls work in combat, they seemed to act like catalysts of sorts for Lulu's magic, and were supposed to be sentient as a result. Some of their actions included matching Lulu's movements, specifically when she performed a high-level magic spell, and running up to foes and tackling them to execute normal physical attacks. The introduction of dolls as weapons in Final Fantasy X marked a fascinating evolution for mage-orientated arms in this series, and that was because it would add another modern twist to the series in light of the growing focus on futuristic settings and realism, as seen in games spearheaded by developers like Yoshinori Kitase and Tetsuya Nomura. Further to this, some could argue that they were quite appropriate as weapons for black mages, as thematically, they could be linked to pop culture occult practices surrounding dolls and voodooism. Standing as one of the most crass weapons in the franchise, the mop in Final Fantasy VII stood out amongst Cid Highwind's traditional dragoon arms, as, well, it was literally a mop. Found in the Bone Village through excavation or purchasing in Junon after getting the Highwind, the mop was categorized as a joke weapon, but it was fully functional within combat, and what's quite interesting, specifically in comparison to other games within the franchise, is that each character had their own joke weapon, with Vincent Valentine, for example, wielding the silver rifle, which was actually a BB gun. Beyond that, some of the other joke weapons, such as Cloud's nail bat and Aerith's umbrella, ended up finding their way into supporting compilation properties. It would see the nail bat resurface within the 7 remake, and the umbrella had a cameo appearance in Crisis Core, where Zack used it in Costa del Sol. Fingers crossed that remains the case within Crisis Core Reunion. Interestingly, these joke weapons would have high strength and great potential to inflict critical hits, but the downside was that they didn't have any materia slots. This, however, would make them ideal weapon choices for use in the Wutai side quest, as during the course of the quest, players would be unable to use materia thanks to Yuffie. Similar to the innovation of using dolls as weapons in Final Fantasy X, the use of cards would not only see a twist in combat mechanics and game lore, but it would continue to evolve throughout the series. Though cards were meant to appear in Final Fantasy V alongside the Gambler job, it was ultimately shelved alongside other jobs such as the Ninja Dog, and instead made its official appearance in Final Fantasy VI, where the job was associated with Setzer. Here, cards became part of a larger weapon set that included other throwable pieces like darts and dice. Amongst this grouping, darts would function as ranged weapons, while dice would be rolled with the achievement of higher numbers inflicting higher damage. They were each quite interesting conceptually, but cards would end up developing a greater presence as the series built out. In the initial sense, they were designed as ranged weapons that could be thrown at enemies to inflict damage, something that outside of Gambit from the X-Men is also possible in real life if enough practice is placed around developing skill in the art of card throwing. After Final Fantasy VI, cards would resurface within Final Fantasy X-2, where it was associated with the Lady Luck dress sphere, but its most prominent appearance has been in Type 0. This would see cards associated with Ace, who was very much the poster child of the game, and in this instance, the comparisons with Gambit were a bit more transparent. Next up, we have forks, which were the weapon of choice for Quina in Final Fantasy IX. Much like the aforementioned Kettle Knuckles, this would see another everyday item transformed into a lethal weapon. Resembling the classic table fork, Quina's weapons were visibly larger and more archaic in design, shaped more like that of a spork. They were used as a melee weapon to stab foes, but what made forks quite interesting was the calculation of their damage output, which was quite unique compared to other weapons in the game. And this was because they dealt random damage, using a value that capped at Quina's strength, rather than just Quina's set strength stat value. This made them relatively unstable in normal combat, but also served to cement Quina's role as that of a mage or ability user as opposed to a physical attacker. Like many of the other orthodox or unconventional weapon entries in the Final Fantasy franchise, forks seemed to be the result of a creative spin on Quina's character, as they were a blue mage chef who quite literally ate their foes to learn their abilities. the humorously bizarre nature of using a fork as a weapon also further complemented the farcical nature of Quina as a character. And that brings us on to our final entry in the list, which was also quite farcical, albeit for different reasons. One of the most curious aspects of Final Fantasy XV was its slew of collaborations with various real-world establishments and figures, including, but not limited to, the Coleman Company, Cup Noodles, Vivienne Westwood, and even Audi. Various in-game items would appear as a direct result of said collaborations, such as the Coleman camping gear, the cast's clothing designed by Hiromu Takahara of the Rowan fashion brand, and the edible cup noodles for the party to consume, as well as the delightful hat for Noctis to wear. But one of the coolest and most unexpected additions to Final Fantasy XV would be one of the products of a collaboration between Square Enix and the Grammy Award-winning DJ, Afrojack. Afrojack had composed the track Braver in collaboration with Square Enix, which was used in the E3 2016 trailer for Final Fantasy XV, before then being included as a playable song in-game when driving the Regalia. During the 2017 Game Developers Conference, we then got to hear another song produced by Afrojack. It was called Afro Sword, and it appeared within the Final Fantasy XV A Challenger Once Again trailer, which dropped on the 2nd of March of that year. Later on, it was announced on the 24th of April that year that Final Fantasy XV patch 1.09 would introduce the Afro Sword, a great sword named directly after Afrojack and designed to look like a soundboard. When Noctis wielded the Afro Sword in combat, the actual song, Afro Sword, would play in place of normal battle music. This same song would also be played during the timed quest, which players had to actually complete to obtain the sword, which cost a whopping 1,000 quest points to unlock. The Afro Sword would be the first instance of a weapon arising from a collaborative effort between a musician and Square Enix. It would also be the first instance in which a weapon influenced the game's battle music to our knowledge, and from its performance right down to its appearance, the Afro Sword was one of the standout collaborative products in Final Fantasy XV, as well as being one of the most distinctive and weird weapons to have ever graced the franchise. And with that, I think we're done. There were 7 of the weirdest weapons in Final Fantasy. What are some of the strangest weapons you've seen in the franchise? Be sure to let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, give us a like and subscribe for more content. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Gregory and Zdawn, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.